Well, on the whipsaw back and forth between Canada and Ukraine, the Canadian situation, of course, I have given priority to. I think that's much more important. It's much closer to where I am, much more relevant to my life. But the Ukraine situation should not be totally ignored, even though I think that it is it's rooted in hype. It's not rooted in reality. But that hype, this brinksmanship, as I've said in the past, could be the undoing of us all, because unfortunately, it is still a potential conflict between the world's two largest nuclear powers, Russia and the United States. And so that's something that can't be ignored. Just as a refresher, it's been my position that, it's been my perspective, I should say, that this is a trumped-up conflict. This is something that doesn't need to happen. It's something that shouldn't happen, and I don't see anyone who stands to benefit from any kind of a war like this. The Russians certainly don't. The Russians have no reason to want this war, no more than they could have wanted it over the past, 8 years. You have the West, which is, well, I should say more specifically the United States and Britain, which is, what is it? Is it DEFCON 1, which is the highest? They're like DEFCON 1, or is it 5? I forget which way the scale goes. Because Russia is moving Russian troops around inside of Russia. That's what they're very concerned about. They say, oh my gosh, this is proof that Russia's going to start a war. Never mind that the U.S. moves U.S. troops around outside of the U.S., all around the world. In fact, we just moved 3,000 troops to Europe, specifically to counter Russia. But don't worry, Russia moving troops inside of Russia, they're the real aggressors. So that should give you the basic gist of how I've been approaching this situation. Moreover, I'm not the only one. The Ukrainian government itself has been doing its level best to downplay all of this rhetoric coming from Britain and the United States, talking about how a Russian invasion is imminent. They've been saying it for months. This is not very good for the psychology of the people in Ukraine. And it's also, they're basically declaring Russia the victory of a war which hasn't started. And so the folks in Kiev, I think, rightly, would like to not be so defeatist and would say, hey, if there really is some big problem, why don't we try and solve it diplomatically? I think that would be what a mature adult would try and do, especially when you're leading a small country next to a very large country. You would want to do, with a very large military, you would want to do everything you can to avoid a war, especially when that's a nuclear-armed state. And so we have a situation in which Russia, the supposed aggressor, has made no threats. Ukraine, the supposed victim, says, hey, we got no issues here. There's no beef. Everything's cool. Everybody calm down. But Britain and the U.S. keep pushing this imminent Russian invasion narrative. And we have new developments on that. But I have to finish the summary of this first. Why is it that the U.S. and Britain are pushing this? The easiest explanation, which is usually the correct one, is that both Biden and Boris Johnson, the leaders of the United States and Great Britain, have had significant domestic issues, scandals in the case of Boris Johnson. I don't know if you would call what Biden's issues a scandal, because it's no one thing. It's just general incompetence and people getting tired of him rather quickly. They both are very unpopular. Their domestic agendas have completely collapsed, and so they've had to pivot to Eastern Europe to try and get the heat off of them. They can beat up on strawman Putin and say, oh my gosh, Putin's such a bad guy, and then people will rally around the flag. It's a very old and tried and true tactic of politicians. When your approval ratings go down, start a war. So, with all that said, I wish that didn't take 5 minutes. because I really want to get to the new stuff, but I haven't talked about the Ukraine thing in a few days, so I wanted to refresh that. We now have Joseph Robinette Biden, President of the United States, the supposed leader of the free world, coming out, reading Putin's mind, saying Putin has made a decision. He wants to invade Ukraine now. He's going to do it. A few days ago, when they were asked, the U.S. government said they did not have any reason to believe that Putin had made a decision. Now, Joe Biden says, I guess he looked into Putin's eyes and he saw his soul, and his soul told him, I'm going to invade Ukraine. But he probably didn't say it in English because I don't believe Putin speaks much English. Now, the Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, a former board member of Raytheon, relevant because Raytheon is going to make all the bombs if the U.S. goes to war with Russia. That's what Raytheon does. So a former Raytheon executive also agreed with Joe Biden, who just happens to be the Secretary of Defense, that Putin has made the decision. He's going to invade Ukraine. How convenient for Raytheon. And so this wasn't a gaffe by Biden. We now have confirmation from two top administration folks. The president, who is not in charge, and the Secretary of Defense. So this seems to be the official stance of the American government at this point. They're saying Putin's going to invade Ukraine. The final decision has been made. They're going to do it. And as old Ned Price told us, what was it, last week? Or a couple weeks ago? They're going to stage a false flag. It's going to be a false flag. Crisis actors. They're going to bring them in. They're going to kill the kids. They're not going to be real kids. They're going to be crisis actors laying there on the ground. And then they're going to make a video. And they're going to put that video out. And then they're going to use it to start a war. Sorry, not the greatest Alex Jones voice, but that's the best I could come up with for old Ned Price. So, what potentially might have been a false flag, what they were referring to, and I'll get to that in a minute, that potentially was carried out last night. There were, and the night before, there were a couple of explosions around, I believe it was Luhansk. I don't think there was anything in Donetsk. Apparently a pipeline was bombed, a gas pipeline. And the rebel government said it was sabotage. So I guess if you're Ned Price, you'll say, hey, this was the false flag. If you are not Ned Price, you'll say, no, this was legitimate sabotage by somebody else. The problem here is that there's no way to prove either of them right. This is kind of the glory in predicting a false flag attack. It's kind of like what I was saying, a couple weeks ago when they predicted this, is that Ned Price said at the time, "Whoa, we're coming out and saying this now. This this BS about we know they're going to do a false flag to try and deter them. So in other words, let me put out this BS. If it doesn't come true, then I'm going to pat myself on the back because I deterred Putin from doing it." Which, whether or not he ever planned on doing it to begin with, is irrelevant, because it's a tautology. You're right either way. But then if there is some sort of an attack, Ned Price can point to it and say, "Oh, look, false flag, false flag." So it's a win-win. It's an easy thing to put out if you're the State Department, because no matter what happens, you can say that you were right. And so now they might try and say they're right because there was this explosion at this pipeline. And the rebels are saying sabotage. Now, additionally, this could also be legitimate sabotage by someone who heard the State Department say, "Oh yeah, we're predicting there's going to be a false flag," knowing that, hey, if I go and bomb this, then it'll look like Putin is staging a false flag. You see how screwed up all of this is? It's just like with the Syrian Red Line and the gas attack. Obama said, I'm going to draw a red line in Syria. Assad cannot gas his own people. I mean it. And then guess what happened? Oh, some Syrians supposedly got gassed, or at least we saw a video that was supposed to depict Syrians getting gassed. And then come a few years later, what do we find out? Oh, it was actually Syrian rebels who staged that gas attack. It was a false flag trying to lure Obama in, because Obama said, hey, I'll invade on behalf of the rebels if there's a gas attack. And so we kind of have a similar situation here. Ned Price going, hey, Putin's going to stage a false flag and try and start a war, and we're going to have to defend Ukraine. And so some Ukrainian guy can say, hey, if I go and actually commit this attack, then the U.S. can blame it and say that was a Russian false flag, and the Russians have to intervene to defend the rebel oblasts and whatnot. And so it's all a great big mess. And you have no real way of knowing what's going on at any given time. We don't know who's doing what. Everyone's going to point fingers at each other. And for some reason, the United States government wants to get up in the middle of it. There's no way of knowing who's the aggressor and who's not, in this particular case. No, Russia moving troops around inside of Russia is not an act of aggression. No, Russia has made no threats as of yet. And, frankly, border skirmishes in the Donbas are not uncommon. It's been happening for years. Their big breakup was in 2014. There's been little skirmishes here and there ever since. We're also heard a report this morning that when the Ukrainians, I guess, were shelling the Donbas republics, which of course they're saying they were shelling each other. The rebels say that the Ukrainians fired first. The Ukrainians say that the rebels fired first. Now Russia is saying that a Ukrainian shell landed inside of Russia. Oh, could this be the false flag? A Ukrainian artillery shell landed in an open field in Russia. So Ukraine fired upon Russia. Could this be the start of a war? And the more you look at this, you just go, God, what the hell's the point? How are you going to make any sense out of this? If you're coming in this with a bias for one side or another, you're going to, these are Rorschach tests. You're going to interpret it as whatever you want. You're going to interpret it as your side being the victim. If you're a real pro-Ukrainian guy, you're going to go, oh my gosh, look at this shell that landed in Russia. That's a false flag. Or this exploded pipeline in Luhansk. Oh, that's a false flag. Or if you're a big pro-Russia guy, you're going to say, look, Ukraine is attacking Russia and the rebels and trying to lure Russia into starting a war so that the U.S. will intervene and crush Russia. And now the U.S. is saying that they'll sanction Russia and lock Russia out of the global financial system. That's a great idea, real great idea. Europe will freeze because they're not going to be able to trade for gas anymore. So there will not be enough natural gas, so they'll have to buy it from the United States. And the world will starve. Because Russia, Belarus, very important to the global fertilizer market. Fertilizer, of course, very important for growing food. Without fertilizer, you can't grow as much food because there's not enough nutrients in the soil. You want to add nutrients into the soil to make it so that you can grow more in the same area, grow more food, feed more people. And in terms of GDP, food may not be, huge because it's such a basic need. There's all this other stuff built on top of the economy, but food's the foundation of the economy. If you don't have food, it doesn't matter. If you've got a lot of high-flying tech companies, you're going to starve. Facebook is not feeding the world. If the U.S. wanted to lock Russia out of the global financial markets, who's going to be fine? Russia. They'll have plenty of gas. They'll have plenty of fertilizer. They'll be able to grow plenty of food. They'll be able to stay warm. They'll be able to power all their vehicles, with reliable energy, not spontaneously combusting Tesla batteries. They'll be able to buy Huawei smartphones from China, which, China, if Russia and all of them are closed off and things escalate, China would probably be it would probably be in their best interest to just go ahead and seize Taiwan, grab all those semiconductors before the U.S. tries to cut China off from the global economy, because they've got plenty of production and consumers in their two countries and their other friends, Kazakhstan or whatever, minor players. But Russia and China, they're two really big countries. They got a huge percentage of the global population. Obviously, China is the manufacturing capital of the world. Russia's got great natural resources. They grow food. Cutting them off, pushing them into the arms of China, and then eventually cutting China off because, after China grabs Taiwan or whatever, we're going to be the big losers, okay? Even if there is no escalation to a nuclear conflict, which I can only hope that will never ever happen, but it's always a possibility, so I got to mention it. China and Russia, both nuclear-armed states. Going to war with either of those and seriously threatening them would lead to mutually assured destruction. So a real war with either of those countries is totally off the table, unless you do want to destroy humanity. But at this point, if we're talking about, just sanctioning Russia, and again, once the precedent is set with Russia, they're going to move and do the same. Russia and China are getting pushed together. Historically, Russia and China were not buddies. They become closer and closer as the U.S., which, the U.S. is going to see China as a big rival regardless, because China is a rising power in the world and growing economy and whatnot. But Russia, there's no real reason why the U.S. has to be aggressive to Russia. They're choosing to, and they're pushing Russia into the arms of China. Now, Zelensky, getting back to Ukraine, he's gallivanting off to Munich for the Munich Security Conference, which I guess is a ho-hum of a bunch of transatlantic elites. The U.S. apparently is very unhappy with Zelensky for attending the Munich Security Conference. They want him, in Kiev on a war footing, wearing a military jacket and probably, wearing a beret or something, parading around in the streets. And Zelensky, just refuses to play along, which I give him some credit for. He's acting like everything is normal, which, frankly, everything should be normal. The only reason why things aren't normal is because Joe Biden and Boris Johnson have failed in their domestic agendas, and they need something to hang their hat on. So they want to go off on an adventure to Ukraine. I mean, they've already moved their embassies out of Kiev. It's absurd. They have given up the city to Russia. That's what they want everyone to believe. Before Russia's even made a threat of going to war with anyone. I mean, this isn't normal. You're not supposed to close your embassy because a country might go to war. You're supposed to keep the embassy open during wars. The point of an embassy is for, your citizens to have a place where they can find a, safe harbor. So I guess I should wrap things up. I still don't think that Putin will be successfully baited into this. At least not what we've seen up until this point. It's not nearly enough to bait him into invading Ukraine. They'd have to do something really aggressive, I think, towards the rebels, because the rebels, I forgot to mention, Donetsk put out a map or some kind of remote report. They're claiming it's a leak from the Kiev government, which is some sort of plot to invade and recapture Donetsk in the next 5 days. That I read as Donetsk trying to propagandize the Russian people in order to put pressure on Putin to do more to help them. Because the way I understand it in Russian politics, the cause of the rebels in eastern Ukraine is very popular amongst regular people, but Putin has been resistant because, frankly, there is no vital Russian national security interest in helping these people. They don't have anything of value for Russia. But if there's enough political pressure, Putin will look weak if he doesn't help them because, the Russians see them as their own people, just on the other side of a different border. And so Putin will look like he's not doing enough to defend the Russian people from aggression from the West. And so he does have a line somewhere. There is a line which the U.S., or however you want to put it, NATO or EU or whatever, they could cross and push Putin into acting. The folks in Donetsk know that, and that's why they are trying to, at this point, in my opinion, go along with this narrative of, oh my gosh, war is imminent. They're joining in the chorus, saying, I think they said 5 days until Kiev, marches on Donetsk. So at this point, we're still not on DEFCON 1 or DEFCON 5 or whatever they call it. War is not imminent. The skirmishes at the line of control are not unheard of. This has happened before, but it is something now that does need to be watched a little more closely. That's my end assessment, is that the situation is escalating. It's continuing to escalate. The question is, will things taper off? So at this point, I will be monitoring it a bit more closely, waiting to see if there is some sort of major attack by either side. And then from there, we'll watch to see what the responses are. So with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.